I would like to address a very good point. Right now, the only people who really have time for Israel are the Christian Zionists, even though they have a very anti-Jewish, and what some people erroneously say is anti-Semitic point of view. The reason is you're quite right. The Christian Zionists want all the Jews to gather in Palestine so Jesus can make a second appearance, rapture all the good Christians up to heaven, let the Jews suffer on the planet Earth. The reason is that Jews overwhelmingly now are turning away from Israel. And even the American Jewish Committee is finding that Jews in North America, American Jews, are finding far less affinity for Israel. Honorable Jews like Mearsheimer, Walt, Finkelstein, Tony Ute, Joel Koval, and other people are finding it necessary to remind people that something is seriously wrong in Israel. And Israel is actually eating itself from within.
Okay. One final comment.
My question is this. Could you possibly elaborate on the massacre of American troops aboard the USS Liberty?
Yes, sir. The USS Liberty was deliberately attacked by Israel in 1967. And it was done so deliberately because the Liberty was a U.S. listening ship, and Israel was planning to execute Egyptian prisoners of war. It could not afford to have the United States Liberty listen in on the communications. They did not want to be caught committing a war crime, because a war criminal wants to do its dirty work in private, in the dark. For more than 90 minutes, the USS Liberty was subjected to a strafing attack. Dozens upon dozens of soldiers, seamen, American sailors were murdered, deliberately murdered. And Lyndon Johnson covered this up because he would not acknowledge that Israel committed a mass murder, and the documentation of this is irrefutable and is extant, and anyone who wants to investigate it may do so. The Liberty was a crime against the United States, and if anyone else had done it, the United States would have gone to war. But Israel gets away with murder literally, because Israel is Israel. And the connection between Zionist money, influence, coercion, and power and media in the United States ensures there will never be proper, honest debate about Israel until forums like this circumvent the national media and expose people to opinions that they might not otherwise have come to hear, and ask them to examine their own prejudices and open their minds and face reality squarely in the face.
I disagree with some of the things you have said and some of the things the opponents have said, but I will defend to the death your right to say them and the right of this library to provide the forum.
Thank you very much.
And possibly even more so the courage of the Vancouver Public Library, its staff and its board in letting this event go ahead. As I said, I may not agree with what you say, but it's important that these venues be permitted to be provided to authors such as you.
So you agree that Islam should be the subject next year?
I look forward to hearing a speaker on Islam. And secondly, I know you'll be talking mostly about the U.S., but could you make some comments on the Canadian government, since it appears to the lay observer that Harper and his foreign policy has made a significant change with respect to the Middle East and to Israel than previous governments. So could you talk about that for a moment, please?
Certainly. Actually, the basic subjugation of Canada to Israeli mouthpiece happened with Paul Martin, and it happened because Erwin Kotler essentially interfered with foreign policy and made Canada become an apologist for Israel at the United Nations. I will tell you one thing about Harper. Before the Palestinians elected their government in Gaza, Harper held a conference call with 3 members of the lobby, and he promised them that he would not recognize Hamas if it were elected. So we have a government, our Prime Minister, openly colluding with agents of a foreign government and predicating Canada's national foreign policy on the interests of a foreign government. I have just been reading recently that the United Canada, Harper, has signed a document that will allow the U.S. to send its troops up here without advance notice for security reasons. Harper is one of the most venal, self-interested traitors this country has ever had the misfortune to be misled by. Harper serves Israel and the United States, which I generally call Israel-America, because to all intents and purposes, there's no distinction. And it's a tragedy to see what has happened under this government. Massive, a Canadian peacekeeper was killed deliberately by Israel, even after being warned off hours before the event. And all this man could do was ask his wife what the hell he was doing in the first place. So I'll tell you what he was doing. He was doing his job. And he was murdered because Israel doesn't want witnesses. And we will not come to the defense of our own people if it would embarrass the Zionist entity in Palestine.
The Arabs say, drive them all into the sea. And the Israelis say that the Palestinians are lice and cancers to be cut out. We have to ignore the fundamentalists and ignore the extremists on both sides and try to form alliances with moderate, informed people to go forward and compromise. Well, I'm sure many people are aware of Theodore Herzl, but also under Carter, there were 20,000 illegals in the settlements, settlers in the settlements, and he was promised no more. They're now about 400,000. Your right has just been ignored. Let's see, I'm trying to read my writing, which I read so quickly.
While you do that, I can make one comment that during the so-called Truce of Oslo, when Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin and Bill Clinton formed that great signing ceremony in '93, during the period until 2000, Israel increased the number of illegal colonies by 100% and doubled the amount of people living in those colonies by 100%. Israel has never abided by any international law and never will.
Well, that's the same recent agreement in Maryland. They did that. Now, as to getting the other point of view, the best place to get the other point of view is in Israel itself, in Haaretz.
You're quite right.
Far more actual debate about what's going on, what they agree with Israel, what they disagree with in Haaretz than we're ever allowed to hear here.
Thank you very much. A very good point. I want to commend you for that, because Haaretz will say things openly that we are not allowed to say here. Like today, Israeli soldiers talked about choking Palestinian boys for sport to see how long they could stay alive and then reviving them, or just pulling their clothes off and just humiliating them.
It's very, sorry. And one of my biggest shocks when I was in Israel is to see that they mandated, and I can't remember which is which, but if you're Israeli or Jewish, then you have a yellow license plate or a blue one, I can't remember which. If you're Arab, you have the other color.
That's correct.
I can't understand how somebody suffered through the Holocaust with a star or something that's yellow, doing this to another group of people. And that's just a mentality.
May I address that quickly?
Yeah. I think we'll have to move on.
Yeah, I just want to say that is truly appalling. And yes, I mean, the Palestinians are being treated like the Untermenschen that the Jews were. But it's interesting to state that the people who wore the star and the people who were persecuted were not the Zionists, because they were the ones who were helping the Nazis. And the fact is that Israel was only created out of pressure and blackmail by the United States and other countries. It did not have a right to exist. It has never had a right to exist. It is the last vestige of Western colonialism in the Arab world, and it is killing everybody.
Okay, I think we should move on over here.
Yes, Mr. Felt, can you describe, is it not true that the Jewish people under Yitzhak Shamir during the 30s were trained in Mussolini's Italy? And Yitzhak Shamir, when he tried to march with the Germans, these records are all in the Jewish Holocaust Museum at the, how would you call that? The Yad Vashem Museum in Jerusalem.
Yes, one of the great things that no one ever talks about is how Yitzhak Shamir wanted to form an alliance with Hitler. And he went to Berchtesgaden to try to persuade Hitler to join with the Jewish army against the British. And Hitler thought about it but said, nah, wasn't interested. Because the sad thing is that the last great unprosecuted war criminals from World War II are the likes of Israel Shamir, David Ben-Gurion, and the likes of Yosef Weitz, people who actually, as I stated here, like Rabbi Joachim Prinz, actively supported the Nazi Reich because they wanted to persecute the Jews so badly they would want to leave, but only to Palestine. And David Ben-Gurion actually said in 1935, and I will paraphrase, if I thought I could save all the Jewish children of Germany by allowing them to emigrate, or risk having half of them die by forcing them to go to Palestine, I would regrettably choose the latter. The Zionists actively took part in the extermination of European Jewry. And that is something, whether you like to believe it or not, is actually written, discussed, and if you want to see who did it, a Zionist writer named Edwin Black